I spent 50 years of my professional life sitting across a desk from people who were about to make the worst decision of their financial lives, and I stopped every single one of them. I explained it clearly, in plain language, without the legal jargon that obscures rather than illuminates. I told them what a power of attorney was, what it permitted, what it meant in the hands of someone who understood its scope and chose to use it without restraint. I told them that trust was not a legal safeguard. I told them that love was not a substitute for due diligence. I said these things to clients for 50 years, and they listened, and they were protected, and I went home satisfied that the law, properly explained, kept people from the most preventable category of catastrophe. Then I went to Bangkok at 76, fell in love with a 34-year-old woman named Anchali, who translated legal documents for a living, signed a power of attorney in a hospital bed before going under for a minor gallbladder procedure, and woke up 4 hours later to find that she had already begun selling everything I owned. By the time I understood what had happened, £312,000 worth of assets had changed hands in 48 hours. Everything moved legally. Everything moved cleanly. She had known exactly what she was doing from the moment she first asked me to sign. I am 77 years old. I want you to understand that when I say I am a solicitor, I do not mean I was someone who pushed paper. I built a practice in Sheffield from nothing in 1974, expanded it to 4 partners, and spent 5 decades specializing in property law and estates. I have seen every variety of financial misfortune that can befall a human being, and I have seen most of it up close, in my office, with a box of tissues on the desk and a legal pad on my knee. I know what power of attorney means. I know it better than almost anyone you will ever meet. And I signed one in a hospital bed in Bangkok because I believed that loving someone and trusting someone were enough to make a legal instrument safe. They are not enough. They have never been enough. That is precisely why the law exists. I taught this to trainee solicitors for 20 years, and I forgot it completely in the space of 18 months. You need to know what my life looked like before Thailand to understand how I arrived at a hospital bed with a pen in my hand. My wife Eleanor died in November 2019, 2 years before I went to Bangkok. We had been married for 41 years. She had Parkinson's for the last 6 of them, and I had managed the practice from home for the final 2 years of her life, taking calls between caring for her, keeping the firm going by the skin of our combined determination. When she died, it was, in the specific way of deaths that follow long illness, both devastating and a release. And the combination of those two things produced a grief that I found harder to manage than simple sorrow, because I could not be entirely honest about it, even with my children. My son Jeffrey Jr., we called him Jeff to distinguish him from me, came from Edinburgh for the funeral and stayed 2 weeks. My daughter Patricia flew in from Toronto. They were kind and present, and they went back to their lives after the 2 weeks were up, as they should have done, and I was left in the house in Broomhill that Eleanor and I had lived in for 32 years. And the silence in that house was the particular silence of a space designed for 2 people containing only one. I sold the practice in February 2021 to a younger partner who'd been angling for it for years and who paid me fairly. I was 75. I had £430,000 in liquid assets between the practice sale and the lifetime pension Eleanor and I had built together. I had a house worth another £380,000 that I owned outright. I had, in the material sense, everything I needed for a comfortable and extended retirement. What I had very little of was reason to get up in the morning. Bangkok came about because of a former client named Neil Ashworth, a retired GP from Worksop who had moved to Thailand 6 years earlier with his second wife and who had sent me a Christmas card every year since, always with a photograph of himself standing somewhere warm and green, looking extremely well. We had stayed in touch by email in the way that solicitor and long-term client sometimes do when the relationship has extended over enough years to have accumulated genuine warmth. After Eleanor died, Neil was one of the people who wrote to me, a proper letter, handwritten, which I noticed, and in it he said that if I ever wanted to come and experience a different kind of life, he had a spare room and I was welcome for as long as I liked. I went in January 2022, meaning to stay 3 weeks. I was in Bangkok, staying in Neil's apartment in the Sathorn area, for 3 months before I booked a flight home. I am not going to dress up what happened in that 3 months as anything more complicated than this. I arrived in Thailand grieving and elderly and lonely in a way that 2 years of widowhood had made permanent, and I found that Bangkok was full of people who were happy to spend time with a retired English solicitor with money in his pocket. I am aware of how that sounds. I was aware of it at the time, intellectually, and it did not stop me from responding to warmth as warmth rather than strategy. I met Anchali in the 3rd week of January through a social gathering at a restaurant on Sathorn Road that Neil's wife organized for a group of Thai professionals and expats who came together periodically for dinner and conversation. It was the kind of evening that exists in Bangkok in a particular way, the combination of Thai and Western sensibilities producing a social atmosphere that I found more interesting than most of what I'd experienced in Sheffield dinner parties for 30 years. Anchali was seated across from me. She was 33 at the time, small and precise in her movements, with very good English, and the particular quality of attention that some people have where you feel, when they are listening to you, that you are the only person in the room. She translated legal documents, contracts, property agreements, court submissions, between Thai, English, and Mandarin. She was freelance and well regarded in her field, as I later confirmed through Neil, who knew 2 lawyers who had used her services. We talked about law for 2 hours. I cannot overstate how unusual that was for me. Eleanor had been a nurse, and had been interested in my work in the generous way of partners who support without sharing the specific enthusiasm. But Anchali asked precise questions about English property law and the differences between how English and Thai courts handled estate administration, and she had opinions grounded in actual knowledge, and the conversation was the most professionally engaging I had had in 2 years of retirement. I walked back to Neil's apartment that night feeling something that I did not immediately identify as dangerous, which was the simple feeling of being interested in something again. We had coffee the following week. Coffee became dinner. By February, we had fallen into a pattern of spending 3 or 4 evenings together per week, and by the time I flew home to Sheffield in March, I had already begun to think about when I would come back. The house in Broomhill felt, after 3 months in Bangkok, not like home, but like a museum, to a life that had already ended. I was back in Thailand in June. I stayed through October. I flew back to Sheffield for Christmas with Jeff and Patricia, and by Christmas it was understood between Anchali and me that the arrangement had become something permanent. I should tell you about the warning, because there was one. Neil gave it to me in September, at a bar near the BTS Saladang station, in the careful way of a man who knows he is going to say something the other person does not want to hear, and who has decided that friendship requires saying it regardless. He said he liked Anchali, and he wanted to be clear about that first. Then he said that the age difference was what it was, and he wasn't going to comment on that, because he was not in a position to throw stones. Then he said that in his 6 years in Thailand, he had known 4 Western men who had become financially entangled with Thai women, and that all 4 had ended badly, and that the pattern in every case had been that the relationship moved very quickly toward arrangements that concentrated financial control in the Thai partner's hands. He said he was not accusing Anchali of anything. He said he was telling me to be careful, because he was fond of me, and because the consequences of not being careful at my age and with my assets were not recoverable. I thanked him and I told him I understood his concern, and I told him that the situation was different because Anchali was a professional woman with an independent income who had not asked me for money and who I was fairly certain was not with me for financial reasons. Then he said, "All right, Leonard, I hope you're right. I was entirely wrong. I know that now. I want to say for the record that I was not entirely sure I was right, even at the time. I was sure enough to proceed, which is a different thing, and a smaller thing, and a thing I am not proud of. I moved into a serviced apartment in Sathorn in January 2023 on a non-immigrant O visa that I renewed every 90 days through an agent Neil recommended. Anchali kept her own apartment, which was nearby, and she spent 3 or 4 nights per week at mine. We went to her family's home in Nakhon Ratchasima, the city Thais call Korat, for Songkran, the Thai New Year Water Festival, in April, a long weekend that involved a level of domestic warmth I had not experienced since Eleanor's illness had changed the texture of home life. Her mother was a small woman in her 60s who fed me continuously and seemed to find me amusing in an affectionate way. Her younger brother Precha was quiet and polite. I remember the color of the light in the courtyard of her mother's house, and the sound of water being poured, and someone in the kitchen singing very quietly. I remember thinking that this was something real. I do not remember thinking it was something to be careful about. That is the thing I most struggle to explain to Jeff and Patricia, who have been kind but who clearly believe at some level that I should have seen what was coming. What was coming looked, from the inside, like a life I had not expected to find again after Eleanor died. Looking back, I can isolate the moments that were calculation and the moments that were genuine. The difficulty is that they looked identical from where I was standing. In the spring of 2023, the relationship had acquired the easy rhythms of something established. Anchali knew how I took my tea and which table at the breakfast place near Sathorn Road I preferred, and that I read the English-language Bangkok Post in the mornings with a concentration that meant I didn't want to be talked to for approximately 40 minutes. I knew that she worked best in the afternoons, that she kept a precise paper calendar alongside her phone because she didn't trust digital-only records, and that she had a habit of running her thumb along the edge of whatever document she was reading, a physical tick that meant she was parsing it carefully. I noticed these things about her with the pleasure of someone who had forgotten what it was to know another person at that level of ordinary detail. Eleanor and I had known each other's habits so completely that we had stopped noticing them. This was the noticing stage again, which I had not expected to experience at 76, and which I valued more than I knew how to say. In May, Anchali mentioned that she had a client, a property developer in Bangkok, who was offering a short-term investment opportunity in a small condominium development near Ari that was selling units off-plan. She said she wasn't asking me to invest, she just mentioned it because the terms looked good and she thought I might be interested as someone with property law background. I invested 800,000 baht, which at the time was approximately £18,500. The return came back 3 months later as promised. 900,000 baht. I found this reassuring rather than suspicious. I should have found it suspicious. A bait return is a very old technique. I had seen it used in property fraud cases in Sheffield in the 1990s. I recognized it as a technique. I chose not to recognize it as what it was. The condo came in August. I want to be precise about how this happened because the legal mechanics of it were elegant in a way I can appreciate even now, which is perhaps the most peculiar thing about my situation. Under Thai law, foreigners cannot own land freehold. Foreigners can own condominium units outright if the building's foreign ownership quota permits, or they can hold long-term leaseholds on other property. Anchali explained this carefully. She was knowledgeable and precise about property law, and I trusted her expertise. And she suggested that a condominium unit in her name would be simpler and cleaner than a leasehold arrangement in mine. We bought a 62-square-meter unit in a new development off Sukhumvit Soi 39 for 4,800,000 baht, which at the exchange rate in August 2023 was £109,000. It went in her name. I paid from my sterling account. This is where Jeff, when I explained it to him later, went very quiet. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, you know better than anyone what that means legally." I do know. I knew at the time. What I told myself at the time was that it was a technicality of Thai property law, that the relationship had the substance of a marriage, regardless of what documents said, that the practical reality was what mattered, rather than the formal legal position. I had told clients not to think this way for 50 years. There is a precise legal term for the thing I was doing. It is called magical thinking, and it has no standing in any court in the world. By October 2023, I was settled into what felt like a life. I had the apartment in Sathorn, the condo with Anchali nearby, a loose routine of morning walks along the Chao Phraya River, where the boat traffic created a particular rhythm I found meditative. I had lunches with Neil occasionally, at a place near Ceylon that did an excellent fish curry, evenings with Anchali most nights, and a volunteer arrangement with a small English-language legal advice service for expats that gave me 2 useful afternoons a week. I felt, in a way I had not felt since before Eleanor's illness had changed everything. Like a man with a shape to his days and something genuine ahead of him. I didn't notice the phone calls changing. I want to be careful about how I say this because I don't want to construct, in retrospect, a cleaner narrative of warning signs than the reality warranted. There were things that registered and didn't register at the time. From around November, Anchali spent more time on her phone, and when she was on the phone she moved to another room, which she hadn't previously done. I noticed this the way you notice a sound your house is making that you can't quite locate, registering it without processing it, because processing it would have required me to take it seriously, and taking it seriously would have required me to act on it. I told myself she had clients whose matters were confidential. She was a legal document translator. Confidentiality was not just reasonable, it was professionally required. I told myself this in the way you tell yourself things that you want to be true and that are technically accurate, and that nonetheless aren't the explanation. She introduced me to her friend Sutita in November, who worked in property administration. Sutita was friendly and asked detailed questions about how long I planned to stay in Bangkok and what my asset situation in the UK looked like, framed as casual conversation. I remember answering non-committally and thinking, briefly, that the questions were more specific than social curiosity usually warranted. I remember the restaurant where we had that dinner, a Thai place on Selam Road, with wooden screens between the tables, and a kind of quiet that made conversation feel private, even in a full room. I remember what I ate, which was a duck curry with green papaya salad, because I ordered it again the following week at the same place, and it wasn't as good the second time. Looking back, those questions from Sutita were not casual conversation. Sutita was assessing, with professional thoroughness, the scope of what was available and how quickly it could be liquidated. At the time, I thought she was simply a curious woman who liked talking about money, which in Bangkok is not uncommon. Then December brought the gallbladder. It was not serious. A standard laparoscopic cholecystectomy, routine surgery. The consultant at Bumrungrad International Hospital in Sukhumvit explained it with the calm efficiency of someone who has done it many hundreds of times. I had been having intermittent pain since October, and had been putting off seeing a doctor in the slightly stubborn way of men my age who don't want to find out something is wrong. When I finally went, the surgical recommendation was clear and the timeline was prompt. They suggested doing it within 2 weeks given my age and the risk of complications if I let it go. I was not frightened. The surgery was simple. The risk was minimal. But I was 76, going under general anesthetic in a country I did not fully understand legally, and Anchali suggested, with gentle practicality, that it would be sensible for her to hold my power of attorney during the period of the surgery and recovery, in case anything needed to be managed while I was incapacitated. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment. She suggested it would be sensible for her to hold my power of attorney. A legal document translator. A woman who translated property agreements and court submissions for a living and understood, with the precision of a professional, exactly what that instrument permitted and exactly how quickly it could be used once executed. She suggested it gently and practically, in the way she approached most things, with a calm organizational logic that I had always found reassuring, and I agreed. The document she brought to the hospital was a general power of attorney. I should have asked for a limited, specific-purpose instrument, one that authorized her to manage only clearly defined Thai affairs during the specific period of my surgery and recovery, capped at a defined monetary value, with an automatic expiry date. That is what I would have recommended to any client who came to me with this scenario. A limited POA, specific in scope, time-bounded, with no authority over UK accounts or assets held outside Thai jurisdiction. I knew this with the automatic completeness of someone who had drafted the relevant documents hundreds of times. She brought a general POA, the broadest possible form. The anesthetist was standing in the doorway, indicating the preparation team was ready. I read the document in the way you read something when you have already decided to sign it, which is to say I read it without truly reading it, and I signed it, and they wheeled me toward a room I have no memory of entering. There are explanations I could give for why I agreed. I was about to go under general anesthetic and there was a small but non-zero chance something could go wrong. I had no family in Thailand. Jeff was in Edinburgh, Patricia was in Toronto, and neither of them had any standing to manage Thai affairs regardless. Neil was the only person I fully trusted locally, and I did not feel I could ask him to take on that responsibility. The practical argument for someone holding POA during a surgical procedure is not unreasonable on its face. All of this is true. What is also true is that I knew, with 50 years of professional clarity, what a power of attorney meant in absolute terms, and I signed it in a hospital bed the morning of the surgery because I believed that Anchali loved me and that love made the document safe. It is the most precise professional irony of my life, and I will carry it until I die. The surgery took 4 hours. I came around in the recovery ward at around 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I remember the ceiling tiles. I remember the particular quality of light in Thai hospitals, which is bright and very white. I remember a nurse checking something on a monitor and smiling when I opened my eyes. I felt groggy and vaguely uncomfortable around the incision sites, which was expected. Anchali was not there. The nurse said my partner had sent a message that she had been called to an urgent work matter and would visit that evening. I thought nothing of it. I lay there looking at the ceiling tiles and feeling the comfortable blankness of someone who has just come through general anesthetic and whose body is explaining that rest is now the entire agenda. She did not come that evening. She sent a message saying the work matter had extended and she would see me the next day. I slept. The next morning the consultant came and confirmed that the surgery had gone well and that I could expect to be discharged the following day. I sent Anchali a message saying I was doing well and asking if she was all right. She sent back a brief message saying she was fine, things were busy, she would see me soon. I noticed, in the particular clarity that sometimes comes after surgery when the mind is clean and the body's demands are simple, that the message was shorter and more impersonal than her messages usually were. I noticed it, and I was too tired and too recently out of surgery to pursue it, and I told myself she was managing a difficult client matter. It was Neil who called me on the second day in hospital. He called in the morning, and his voice had the specific quality of a person who has found something out and is managing how they are going to say it. He said he'd heard something, and he needed to come and see me. He came at noon. What Neil told me was this. A contact of his in property administration, a Thai woman named Wasana, who worked for the same agency that had handled our condo purchase, had called him the previous afternoon in a state of some agitation. She had recognized Leonard Carver, the name on the power of attorney documents that had come through her agency, as the elderly English gentleman who had bought the Sukhumvit Soy 39 unit. The unit had been sold the previous day, that is, the day of my surgery, for 4,650,000 baht, approximately £106,000, to a buyer whose paperwork had been prepared in advance and whose transfer cleared within the same working day. The transaction was legally executed under a power of attorney signed by Leonard Carver. The sale was completed and the funds transferred to an account that Wasana, reviewing the paperwork, did not recognize as corresponding to any of the usual agency accounts. I listened to Neil say this while lying in a hospital bed with stitches in my abdomen. I remember looking at the ceiling tiles again. They had a faint pattern in them that I hadn't noticed before. Small stippled irregularities in the white surface that became visible if you looked long enough. Neil was still talking. He said he'd made some calls. He said the car, I had purchased a second-hand Honda CR-V in September for personal use, which Anchali had managed because I hadn't wanted to deal with the Thai registration process and she had offered, had also been sold. That sale appeared to have completed on the afternoon of my surgery as well. The car had been registered in Anchali's name for practical reasons I had accepted at the time, and was therefore legally hers to sell without my knowledge or consent. I asked Neil how much the car had gone for. He said he wasn't certain, but the model and year suggested approximately 450,000 baht, around 10,000 pounds. I asked him about the condo. He repeated the figure, 106,000 pounds. I asked him what else there might be to find. He said he didn't know yet. He said he thought I should call my bank in the UK before I did anything else. I called Barclays from the hospital bed. I had a current account and a savings account with them, both accessible by internet banking, and I had set up a third-party notification email on the savings account that was, and here is the specific mechanism that she had used, listed as a secondary notification address with Anchali's email. The access itself required my own credentials, but notifications of large transfers went to both addresses. What this meant, as the Barclays fraud team explained when I called them, was that while she could not access the account directly, she had been receiving notifications of my balance and transaction history for the 8 months since I'd set up the notification, and she had known to the penny what was available. 2 SWIFT transfers had been initiated from my UK savings account in the preceding 48 hours. I had initiated them. That is what the records showed. I had not initiated them. What had happened, and this is where the power of attorney intersected with something more complicated, was that Anchali had appeared at a Barclays International Liaison Point in Bangkok with the executed power of attorney, my passport details, and supporting documentation whose provenance I still do not fully understand, and had authorized transfers totaling 187,000 pounds to a Thai bank account. The transfers had gone through. Under the power of attorney, which was general in scope, I had signed a general POA, not a limited one, because she had presented me with the document already drafted, and I had been about to go under anesthetic. She had the legal authority to conduct those transactions on my behalf. 187,000 pounds from the savings account. 106,000 pounds from the condo sale. The Honda at 10,000 pounds. An investment account with a Thai broker where I had placed 1,200,000 baht in fixed-term instruments in October. She had liquidated it, absorbing the early exit penalty, for approximately 1,150,000 baht, roughly 26,000 pounds. I sat in the hospital bed with my phone and a notepad I had asked the nurse for, and I worked through the arithmetic with the methodical care that 50 years of legal practice had made completely automatic, the way a pianist's hands know a piece even when the mind is elsewhere. I did the additions twice. I confirmed the exchange rates. I cross-checked the figures from memory against the bank statements I had open on my phone. I did all of this with an exactness that I suspect was partly genuine professional habit and partly the mind's way of remaining functional by giving it something concrete to do in the presence of something too large to process. The total was the total regardless of how carefully I calculated it. 329,000 pounds. Gone in 48 hours. A portion of it while I was under general anesthetic in a room I have no memory of entering. I called Anchali that afternoon, from the hospital bed, with Neil sitting in the chair beside me. I had been putting off the call for 2 hours, in the way you put off confirming something you already know, because confirmation closes the last remaining door. I had Neil there partly because I wanted a witness, and partly because I did not trust my own reactions enough to handle it alone. The call rang 12 times and went to voicemail. I called again. The same. I sent a message and watched it move from delivered to read. No reply came. I lay in the hospital bed with the notepad on my chest and the ceiling tiles with their faint stippled pattern above me, and I tried to feel something appropriate to what had happened. What I felt was a kind of vast flatness, as if the emotional landscape had been abruptly leveled and I was standing in the middle of it without any landmarks. I am aware that this is the definition of shock. I am also aware that it is the beginning of what the selected arc for this story calls numb resignation, and I can tell you that the name is accurate. It is not peaceful. It is simply the absence of the capacity to feel the full weight of what has occurred, and the full weight arriving gradually over the following days and weeks is, if anything, worse. Neil drove me home from the hospital the next day, and came in and sat with me while I made the calls. I called my solicitor in Sheffield, a younger woman named Jennifer, who had taken over one of my former client files when I retired, and with whom I had stayed in loose professional contact. She listened to the full account and was direct about the English law position. The power of attorney had been validly executed. The transactions were legally authorized. The question of fraud depended on what could be proven about the intent at the time of signing. She said I needed Thai legal advice immediately and gave me the name of a firm in Bangkok that specialized in cases involving foreigners. The Thai lawyer, a quiet man named Thaksin, who worked from an office near Ploenchit, spent 2 hours with me the following week. He confirmed what I had already understood, which was that the legal position was extremely difficult. The power of attorney was genuine. I had signed it. I had not been coerced in any way that I could prove, and I had signed it as a solicitor who understood its scope. Every transaction executed under it was legally valid. The property sale had been properly documented. The bank transfers had been authorized. He said there might be grounds for a criminal complaint if I could demonstrate that the intent to defraud had existed prior to the signing, that the power of attorney had been obtained by deception rather than genuine need. He said demonstrating this would be expensive and slow and would require evidence he was not currently optimistic about obtaining. He said the honest probability of recovery was low. I asked him directly what he thought I should do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought I should return to England and begin rebuilding what I could rebuild there, and pursue a civil action from there if I felt the cost and time were justified. He said staying in Bangkok to fight a legal battle on uncertain odds while my remaining assets sat in a jurisdiction I couldn't fully navigate was not, in his professional view, advisable. He said this with the particular gentleness of a man who has given similar advice many times and knows how it lands. What nobody could tell me was what to do about the fact that £312,000, because that is the figure when I account for the legal fees I'd already spent and the cost of the hospital stay, which the travel insurance thankfully covered, was simply gone. Not lost in a market downturn or spent on something I could point to. Gone. Moved, legally, by a woman who had understood from the beginning what she was going to do, and had taken 18 months to set up the conditions under which she could do it. The pre-arranged buyers for every asset category, the property, the vehicle, the investment account, confirmed what Thaksin had suspected. This was not opportunism that arose from the surgery. The buyers had been identified before the power of attorney was signed. The entire architecture had been constructed while I was falling in love. I called Jeff from Bangkok the day after the meeting with Thaksin. I had been dreading this call in the specific way of a parent who has spent their professional life advising others and must now tell their child they have made the most basic mistake on the list. Jeff listened without interrupting, which took considerable self-control on his part, I suspect. When I finished, he said, "Dad, are you all right physically?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Good, come home." There was a pause, and then he said, very quietly, "I'm sorry this happened." He did not say anything about the power of attorney or about what I knew versus what I did. He has not said anything about it since, which is either extraordinary filial tact or the recognition that I am saying it to myself in sufficient volume that adding to it would be redundant. Patricia called 2 hours later. She had been briefed by Jeff. She was less restrained, which is her way and which I don't hold against her. She said, "Dad, you are a retired solicitor. You have literally drafted thousands of these documents. How did you let this happen?" I said I knew. She said, "I'm not angry. I'm just, how?" I said I thought I was in love. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, come home." That was the whole conversation. I packed what I had in the Sathorn apartment in a week. There was not much. I had not thankfully shipped furniture or personal effects from Sheffield, having maintained the house there throughout. The apartment contents were minimal: clothes, books, a laptop, the small accumulation of a year of daily life in a city. I called Neil on the last day, and he came over, and we sat on the balcony of the apartment and drank tea and looked out over the Bangkok skyline that I had come to find genuinely beautiful, the mix of glass towers and temple spires and the great brown width of the Chao Phraya in the distance. Neil said he was sorry. I said he had warned me. He said warning someone and them not heeding it didn't mean you stopped being sorry. I thought that was generous. I didn't tell him that. At Suvarnabhumi Airport, waiting for the Heathrow flight, I sat in the departure lounge with a cup of very bad coffee and thought about what I was going back to. The house in Broomhill was mine outright, untouched by any of this. My pension income continued. I was not destitute. I was, at 77, a man who had lost £312,000 and who would spend the rest of his life with the specific knowledge of why. Not because he had been naive, not because he hadn't understood what he was signing, because he had understood perfectly and signed it anyway, and the distance between professional knowledge and personal wisdom had turned out to be exactly the distance a determined woman needed to take everything. I am back in Sheffield now. The house in Broomhill is the same as I left it. The silence is the same silence it was before Thailand, which is the silence of a space designed for two people containing only one. And I have come back to it, without the thing that Bangkok briefly gave me, which was the feeling that the silence might eventually be filled again. I don't know if I'll pursue the civil action. Thaksin sent me a follow-up assessment 3 weeks after I returned, and the figures on probable recovery versus probable cost are not encouraging. I have put the folder in a drawer. I take it out occasionally, read the first page, and put it back. Jeff visited last month. He sat in Eleanor's chair in the sitting room and drank tea and didn't ask me about Bangkok unless I brought it up, which I did, eventually, because sitting in silence about it felt worse than saying it out loud. I told him that what I kept returning to was not the money, which was gone and which I understood to be gone with a finality that legal training made easier to process than it might otherwise have been. What I kept returning to was the 18 months I had spent believing something was real that had been, from the other side, entirely constructed. The dinners and the conversations about law and the Songkran weekend in Korat, with her mother feeding me continuously in the courtyard, and that particular quality of light in the afternoon. I kept trying to separate what had been genuine from what had been performance, and I found I had no reliable method for doing it. That is what 50 years of legal practice had not equipped me for. I had every instrument for understanding what was on paper. I had none for understanding what was intended. Patricia called after Jeff's visit. She asked if I was eating properly. I told her I was. She asked if I was sleeping. I told her mostly. She said she was thinking of coming for Christmas, and I told her I would like that very much. We talked for an hour about her children and her husband's job and a renovations project they were undertaking, and it was the most ordinary conversation I had had in months, and it was precisely what I needed. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a while and thought that this ordinary life, ordinary conversation, the unremarkable texture of family connection, was what I had been trying to supplement in Bangkok rather than replace, and that the distinction had turned out to matter enormously. There is only one thing I want to say to anyone watching this who is older and has liquid assets and is in, or is considering entering, a relationship in Thailand or anywhere else with someone significantly younger than themselves. Not because those relationships are automatically fraudulent. I am not naive enough to believe that, and I have seen enough of human behavior to know that love in its genuine form observes no demographic rules. What I want to say is this: a power of attorney is not a love letter. It is not a declaration of trust. It is a legal instrument with specific, absolute, enforceable consequences, and the feelings you have when you sign it have no legal standing whatsoever. I explained this to clients for 50 years. I explained it clearly and in plain language, across a desk, to people who were about to make exactly the mistake I was about to make, and I stopped every one of them. I could not stop myself. Do not let someone bring a general power of attorney to your hospital bed. If you are in a country where you need someone to act on your behalf during a medical procedure, speak to a lawyer first. A lawyer you have found independently, not one recommended by the person who will hold the document. Get a limited POA with a specific scope and an expiry date. Make sure your family knows it exists. These are not complicated precautions. They are the same precautions I would have outlined without hesitation to any client who walked through my door with this scenario. I know them completely. I ignored them entirely. Do not do what I did. The departure lounge coffee at Suvarnabhumi was terrible. I remember that very clearly, and I don't know why that detail has stayed with me while larger things have blurred. Maybe it's because it was the last thing I tasted in Thailand. Maybe it's because the mind, when it has absorbed more than it can comfortably process, takes refuge in the irrelevant and the specific. The coffee was terrible, and the flight was 11 hours, and I slept for most of it, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake reviewing every decision, cataloging every error, in the exhaustive way of a man who has spent his career reviewing documents for errors. Instead, I slept. I woke up over somewhere in Central Asia and looked out the window at the darkness and the lights of whatever city was below, and I thought, I am going home. Not with what I left with, but I am going home. That was enough, for that moment, to be getting on with.